All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, apologies for that. I'm not sure.
This is Ingrid. I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm back too.
Okay, that has never happened to me before. Very well. We still have some folks that are left on the line.
Oh, I think they've all joined back in, which is nice. Thank you for coming back.
So Don, you have the comm back. Your screen should be showing.
Okay, there we are.
So
I think I was just starting to say that I think an important way to look at some of this stuff is to kind of change the way we talk about things. We tend to focus a lot on how to improve the efficiency of. Oh, am I on?
No, you're on. You're on.
I hear you.
Okay, I was hearing something telling me I was unmuted when I thought I already was. One of the ways that I like to talk about this to kind of shift the way of thinking about it is that we need to shift from a primary focus on making more efficient cars to making a transportation system that's more efficient than cars. And we can say that about a lot of different systems that when we see innovations that make a difference, they tend to involve changing technologies or changing infrastructures, which, by the way, relatedly, says something about why we struggle to change schools, is that we've stuck with the same infrastructure and technologies in a lot of ways for a very, very long time. So there's interesting parallels there to changes in systems, but I really think that kind of paradigm shift is very, very important and not talked about enough. And I'll also note that in thinking about different energy technologies, the only truly energy or environmentally friendly energy is the energy you don't use. It's when you're making lots and lots of energy, no matter how you do it, it's got substantial environmental consequences. Although coal, for example, has a lot more negative environmental consequences than solar, but solar is not free environmentally or economically. Do we want to take maybe one more question on this slide and then move on to the next piece? Or not?
Well, Don, the questions all got erased when we got kicked out. So we're just going to have to keep moving forward.
Alrighty, we can do that. So we're going to shift gears and go towards the end of the book and flip over to a Prezi, which is not there, here. Let me get that up to full screen. And so this is drawing from chapter 11. It's two sections of chapter 11, looking at fire and brimstone in Fort McMurray, and I'm just going to kind of dig into that. And of course, it comes from the teacher-friendly guide. And I'll ask you to sort of reflectively think about what fire and brimstone brings to mind, and really what the purpose of this section of the book is to help us think about how to be cautious in using doom and gloom in our discussions, because that can often have undesired effects. But I think if we're more thoughtful about where this kind of rhetoric comes from, then we'll use it more effectively, or sometimes opt not to use it at all. So what do you picture when we think about fire and brimstone, and how does it relate to the way you see the world, and maybe how it relates to the way some of your students might see the world that differs from the way you see the world is very much worth thinking about. Fire and brimstone comes from the book of Revelation, and a quote from the King James Version of the Bible. And the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone where the beast and false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. Nice cheery thought to keep us going, and that's 100-year-old, or I'm sorry, 400-year-old or so depiction of what fire and brimstone looks like. And here's a more modern look at it. I don't know if this one's going to work, but hold it up.
What he means is Old Testament, Mr. Mayor. Real wrath of God type stuff. Fire and brimstone coming down from the skies. Rivers and seas boiling. 40 years of darkness, earthquakes, volcanoes. The dead rising from the grave. Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together. Mass hysteria. Enough, I get the point.
So there you go. Where this section of the book came from was in the summer of 2016, spring and summer of 2016, there were massive fires in Fort McMurray in Alberta, Canada. And we'll just, take a quick look at some video of that. Mute that. And I saw this and I thought, oh my gosh, that looks like fire and brimstone, which now, of course, we're seeing in California. The fires of the spring and summer of 2016 in Fort McMurray led to the largest evacuation in Canadian history, the most expensive natural disaster in Canadian history. 90,000 people, the video here came out during the fires and said 80,000. It actually was 90,000 people were ultimately evacuated from Fort McMurray. And these fires burned for months, as the California fires are doing now. And I thought, wow, that looks like fire and brimstone. So that led me to some more thinking about fire and brimstone and apocalyptic rhetoric, which we've been using apocalyptic rhetoric as long as we've been telling stories. We've been telling stories about the end of the world. The Lorax is, I think, a pretty decent example of that, using fire and brimstone type of imagery to help us think about how to change our ways. And I'll also note that this is actually not a quote from the Lorax, it's a quote from the Onceler in the book, The Lorax. So we've been telling these apocalyptic stories as long as we've been telling stories, and it's often very easy in polarizing issues to find different kinds of apocalyptic stories at both poles of the issue in question. So for climate change, that at one pole, that's the destruction of the environment and civilization, or even the entire Earth. And at the other extreme, it's the economy or the American way of life. And, again, what I'm sort of digging into is are we using these ways of framing these things thoughtfully? And I think sometimes we are, and sometimes we're not. And it's helpful to, and I'll note I'm also the grandson of a preacher, and the son of a librarian who was very interested in religious literacy. So I'm not a religious specialist, but I know more about this than the average American, I think. So apocalyptic stories involve prophecies, and prophecies are predictions. And I think what we're seeing today is predictions made by climate scientists coming true pretty regularly. And we're seeing that, like I said, right now in California, in Fort McMurray, what they saw a couple of summers ago and the fires of last year in California were very much in line with what climate scientists were predicting. So in a certain way, climate scientists were behaving as prophets. Prophecies are more than predictions, however. They're also calls to change one's evil ways and to repent. And to repent is not simply to apologize, but also to change one's ways. And I think climate scientists are not only making predictions, but they're saying why these really pretty horrible, for the most part, changes are taking place. And giving us information about how we ought to repent and change our ways. And I think if you bring that kind of discussion in, that maybe makes the discussion a little bit more effective. Fort McMurray is, I don't know how many folks are aware of the biggest industry in Fort McMurray, but it's the oil sands extraction or tar sands extraction. Oil sands and tar sands are essentially synonyms. It is a really energy intensive and polluting way of getting oil. And this is what it looks like from a satellite view. You can see this is huge. This is a 20-mile scale bar, so the area covered or uncovered by the oil sands extraction in Alberta is just gigantic. And I'm going to step in and look at these huge yellow pyramids. And again, oops, reveal the scale bar. So that's 2,000 feet across. A mile is 5,280 feet. So that's almost 4/10 of a mile. You can see these are gigantic, these huge yellow pyramids. They're stories tall. And to give you a different sort of more concrete scale, that's a tractor trailer right there. And these are, like I said, multiple stories tall. And what they are is brimstone, as it turns out. Brimstone is an archaic term for sulfur. And it gets that name because sulfur forms at the brim of volcanoes, in some volcanoes that is. And it is also a byproduct of refining oil from tar sands. And they sell as much as they can, but they can't sell as much as they produce. If you've ever been to the port in Vancouver, they ship it by rail to Vancouver, and it's there in huge yellow mountains that kind of stink too. But they produce way more than they can sell. And I had let that slip my mind. And as I was thinking about fire and brimstone, I Googled brimstone, and brimstone, like I said, is sulfur. And I thought, wow, that's an impressive coincidence. And in thinking about what's going on elsewhere in the world, and this presentation is a year old now or so, so it doesn't have the current fire seasons, although it mentions them. The Fort McMurray fires are but one example of recent fires of biblical proportions. That's Baton Rouge's Great Flood of 2016, last year's hurricane season, this year's hurricane season, the hurricane that hit the Florida Panhandle and the Southeast earlier this year came ashore with winds 2 miles per hour below Category 5. Just stunning damage, and I think remarkably out of the news now that it shouldn't be. This is Buffalo's knife storm of a couple of years ago, a little more than a couple of years ago. I think it was 2015. This is an open door with a wall of snow. I actually telecommute from Buffalo to Ithaca. This is about 10 miles from my house where this took place, and this picture is about 5 miles from my house. The lake effect cloud covering half of Buffalo. At my house, 10 miles from my house, they got 7 feet of snow. At my house, we got 2 feet. Another 10 miles north of me, they didn't get any. Very interesting lake effects there. And the 2017 and 28 fire seasons are other examples of disasters of biblical proportions that were predicted by the prophets that are climate scientists. And we can think about STEM careers related to those issues as well, but I'm not going to talk about it for the sake of time and moving along. Having said all that, though, it's important to recognize that oil is not evil. chances are very good that wherever you're sitting right now, if you look around you, that everything that you can see at the moment is there in some meaningful way because of fossil fuels. So fossil fuels made our modern way of life possible. They also endanger our modern way of life. And I think it's really quite important when we talk about these things to recognize both of those truths. And we tend to pay attention to one or the other and not both. And I think that neglecting one of these things loses a part of your audience. And if you can attend to both of these realities, then I think you're more likely to keep more of your class with you, because they're both true. And I think both quite important. There are at least 5 ways, 5 reasons for exploring the use of this kind of rhetoric. The first is that we do it all the time. I think we do it a lot of time without thinking about it, and I think if we think about it, we'll do it better. The second is that such approaches of doom and gloom can have different outcomes for different people in the same audience. So some will be motivated to work to reduce potential impacts, some may simply tune out the messaging, and some may be motivated to work in ways opposing the storyteller's goals. And I think it's it's context dependent, depends on the nature of the community you're teaching in. But if you've got more than one person in front of you, you have more than one audience. There's also really good opportunities for interdisciplinary connections, particularly to ELA and the social sciences here. There's really, really important connections to mathematics and other ways for talking about climate change, but for this piece, maybe not so much. Attending to these issues is a vehicle for building understanding and appreciation of complexity. Understanding the use of mythological rhetoric can help identify problematic claims. If an argument is grounded in a Paradise Past narrative, meaning that once upon a time everything was rosy and wonderful, or if it promises a simple cure for multiple problems, or if the rationale is grounded in a narrative of good and evil, you should be suspicious of those claims. It doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong, but those are pretty good red flags for indicating that somebody's oversimplifying and maybe is thinking mythologically rather than scientifically. Well, some bottom lines. So you want to use apocalyptic framing very carefully or not at all, but moral framing is still quite important, and we're going to step through that right now. As noted previously, the world, we've been prophesizing the end of the world as long as we've been telling stories, but it hasn't yet come to pass, and I think that is kind of hopeful. And what I'm going to do next is step through some of my own family history as an example, not as something that you necessarily want to share directly with your own students, but think about how to tell your own story. And I'm really just going to read pretty directly from the slides here, because I haven't gotten this memorized. If I was a real actor, I would memorize this stuff and rattle it off. So we live in wonderful, horrible times, and teaching about climate change can be horribly depressing work. It seems as though we are marching headlong into hellish times and are not sufficiently rising to the challenge. This, to some degree, is the natural state of things. We have always lived in horrible times, if you look at it that way, which I tend to do. We've also always lived in marvelous times. Sometimes I can see that too, but reminders are helpful. When the situation becomes dire, as it seems to be doing now, we do have a history of rising to meet the ominous challenges. It is my hope we're in the process of doing that now. To consider the concept of wonderful, horrible times, I'm going to quickly step through 5 generations of my own family history. My great-grandfather, Edgar Loomis, was born in 1843 in Lebanon, Connecticut, and my great-grandmother, his wife, Minnie Hardy, was born in 1847 in Ohio. Slavery was still firmly entrenched in the American South, and Adget and his brother Lucius both fought in the Union Army, and Lucius died at the Andersonville prison camp. Clearly, these were horrible times. And there is my great-grandfather in his Union Army uniform and his dear brother Lucius. The Civil War ended and my great-grandfather marched in front of President Lincoln. And I'd like to pause here and point out that I just talked to my Aunt Mildred the day before yesterday, who is 92 and knew my great-grandfather, and her twin is still alive as well. So I know people alive today who know someone who marched in front of Abraham Lincoln. So I'm 2 degrees of separation from Abraham Lincoln, and now you're 3 degrees of separation from Abraham Lincoln. It really wasn't that long ago. Horrible times were not over, but the abomination that was slavery did come to an end. Adget and Minnie married in 1871 and honeymooned in Niagara Falls. They went on to have 5 daughters and 4 sons and were married for more than 50 years. The brood included twins, Ruth and Ralph, born in 1891. Ralph was my grandfather. I don't know if his life was wonderful, but it did have some wonderful outcomes. And there are my great-grandparents on their honeymoon in Niagara Falls. If you cross your eyes, you can get a little 3D effect there. My grandfather also saw the tragedy of war, serving in a machine gunner's unit in World War I. He also saw pestilence, helping to manage an impromptu hospital during the Spanish flu epidemic. His twin, Ruth, died as a young woman, probably a suicide. But as these horrible things were going on, wonderful things were happening too. Nellie Brown, my grandmother, was the only woman in the University of Missouri's Rocky Mountain Field Camp, I think, in 1918. And Grandpa went on to earn a master's degree in agricultural economics and then a divinity degree. As an extension agent, he was effective in helping bring an end to swine cholera. He married Nellie, and they had 4 children, including twins of their own, Carolyn and Marilyn, my mother, who were born in 1931. And my grandparents were married for more than 50 years. Grandpa managed a dairy co-op and preached in several churches, and returned to agricultural extension work for the University of Missouri in 1936. And Grandma taught physical geography and more. And there's my mom and her twin. My mom always noted that she was never smiling, and her twin Carolyn was always the smiler. And there's Adolf Hitler. Hitler rose to power in Europe, and the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, bringing the U.S. into World War II, and my grandfather was fired from the extension as, quote, the extension didn't need any pacifists, remembering that he came by it honestly as a machine gunner in World War I. A few years later, my father, Roger, enlisted in the Navy, though fortunately the war was in its final year. These were horrible times, but the war ended, and my dad served until just before the Korean War began. My folks met at the University of Missouri, Dad attending on the GI Bill. And there's the Cuyahoga River on fire. And Jim Crow was still festering in the South, and Joe McCarthy was feeding the Red Scare, and rock and roll was coming up, and life expectancy was growing, and the skies were black with smoke and smog, and rivers caught fire. And my parents married and had 6 kids, beginning with my brother in 1952 and ending with me in 1963, just a few months before Kennedy was killed. And Dad worked on technologies to see people through the forests of Southeast Asia, and my brothers worried about but were not called for the draft. And my mom was a university librarian who wrote books about books, and Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy were killed, and riots, and there was Woodstock and the Civil Rights Act and the Environmental Protection Agency. They were wonderful, horrible times, and Mom and Dad were married for more than 50 years. And there's us. I am the cute one. Hard to do this without hearing you. And Richard Nixon and Kent State and free love and disco, and the lakes and rivers got cleaner, and the bald eagle came back, and eventually I got married, and we had 2 wonderful kids. Kiana born in 2001, just a few months before September 11th, and Nellie in 2004, as the country grew more and more mired in America's longest war. And there's the village people. The world won't end. All along, we worried about the fate of our children in these turbulent times, whatever time it happened to be. All along, horrible things were happening that looked like the end of the world. And each time it looked like the end of the world, we did things to make it not be the end of the world. And okay, it never really looked like the end of the world, though it may have looked like the end of civilization. That doesn't need saving. This might. And my girls. Most people are beautiful. Yes, horrible things are happening now. This was largely written in July of 2016, in the aftermath of a series of horrible shootings that looks to be an unending series of horrible shootings. But violent crime is actually at its lowest level in decades, which is pretty wonderful. And in 2016 went down as the hottest year on record, which brought unprecedented droughts, floods, and fires to various parts of the world, which is pretty horrible. And my daughters are kind, hardworking, smart, happy, and engaged in things that make the world a better place, and they're beautiful. And hopefully your kids are too, and so are you. And there's the hottest year on record. I think 2018 may be on track to break that. There are horrible things in the world. When the horror becomes clear to enough people, we do something about it to make it less horrible. Let's do that now and celebrate the wonderful things too. We all want to be on the right side of history for the ones we love. So that's the fire and brimstone piece. There's more that we can dig into on rules of thumb for talking about controversial issues. But I'm going to stop there and take some questions, discussion, what have you.
Thanks, thanks, Don. That was a great trip and story that you've taken us all down. I mean, I personally appreciate including that perspective in the discussion of teaching climate. We've had a couple of questions that go back to the document from the Heartland Institute that you had both mentioned earlier in the at the beginning of the webinar. And a question that was asked that I thought was sort of interesting was by a way of moral framing. Do you think that the publications of the Heartland Institute are intentioned from their perspective to correct the record? Do you feel that they are intentionally misleading? And if so, for what purpose?
Great question.
And yeah, I didn't want to go off myself, but I thought you would be a better person to represent that.
Well, I think that generally most people who reject the scientific consensus on climate change, which I sum up with 3 points. Climate change is real, and if you would rather use the term global warming, that's fine. Both things are going on, climate change and global warming. So that is real. It's a serious problem. It's caused by us, and we can do things to make it less bad. I think I said 3 points and then gave 4. So there are 4 points. It's real. It's caused by us. It's a serious problem, and we can do things to make it less bad. And I think most people who reject that are not lying, but they're wrong. And we respond to people who are wrong in a different way than we respond to people who are wrong unintentionally. Then we respond to people who are lying and who are intentionally wrong. And it's often really hard to tell the difference. And I tend to default to believing that people are basically honest. For one thing, the arguments for somebody who is lying, for somebody who's simply wrong, are often the very same as for if they're actually lying. If they're lying, it's a little harder to deal with. I do think there are, my gut says there are some people at the Heartland Institute who know they're being deceptive. And it's pretty clear from some documents that people working for energy companies knew many years ago that climate change was a real and serious threat caused by primarily by the burning of fossil fuels, and they worked to cover that up. And I think that's criminal, and I hope that the various court cases that are addressing that are successful. That's not quite what your question was, but it's all kind of background. I do think you'll generally be more successful treating people with kid gloves than calling them jerks, and actually looking at the rules for talking about controversial issues. Be nice is one of them. Somewhere in here it says, for the most part, people aren't lying. Where is that? Oh, right there. 1B there. For the most part, people aren't lying. They largely believe what they say. That's not true of 100% of people. But I think you're more likely to be successful if you treat people as if they're honestly wrong instead of dishonestly wrong. One thing is very clear, and that's if you call someone a jerk because of their position on this, you're very, very unlikely to change their mind. They don't go, oh, you're right, I am a jerk. I should agree with you. That's not the way the human mind tends to work. So that relates to the point C1C there. Advocacy can deepen convictions more than understanding. So you want to be careful about how you approach that and not end up in a debate. You want to move from debate to discussion, which is in the second point. There is, by the way, a link to a Prezi on this right there. But I don't think we have time to dig into that, but know that it's there and it's in the slides as well, in the PowerPoint slides, that is. So maybe that's enough said on that.
I just want to make, if it's okay, one quick comment about that question too. I remember in the Heartland Institute's book, there was one particular graph, a time series graph of global surface temperature, and it seemed to show that the Earth had not warmed over time, sort of over the 20th century. But if you look closely, you saw they left out data from recent years, or maybe recent decades. I'd have to look at it because I don't remember the exact years that they left out. It's hard to, and those data are readily available, as are the older data. So it's hard to imagine why one would make that plot if you're not trying to be deceptive. But that's just one example.
Yep. I agree. I think that folks at the Heartland, many folks at the Heartland Institute, I think, are being intentionally deceptive.
And if I remember correctly, in your book, you do actually have quite a few resources that focus on aspects, if I may be so bold to say, about sort of the psychology of communicating about climate change.
Yeah.
And I really would recommend, if people have not yet, I mean, the link to the book should have been in the registration that everyone received, and it's a free download, and it's a terrific book with many resources there. So I really urge people to check it out and see for themselves how many just great resources there are. So are there any other sort of major questions that folks have right now, or do you want to continue, Don, Ingrid, with?
I can.
Yes, please.
Okay, sure. Let me click on to the next Prezi here. And it's 8:45, so we won't get through all of this, but I'll introduce a little bit of it. I think there's stuff of interest here. If it loads. There we go. So it'll take a moment for the images to come in.
And just a reminder, Don, that we do have a few closing slides that we want to be able to. Yeah.
Great. So this is drawing from a lot of our work at the Paleontological Research Institution across a number of different controversial issues. We've written a book on hydrofracking that does, by the way, include a chapter about teaching about hydrofracking. It's focused primarily on the Marcellus Shale, which that's a chunk of the Marcellus Shale in my hand there. and some of our other books, and we also have a book. Oops, zoomed into the wrong place there. We have a number of books on evolution and teaching evolution, and we have books on hydrofracking, and we have books on climate change. And you might look at the things that we do and say, well, what do those people want to get shot? Why are they picking the most controversial issues out there? And as it happens, all of these controversial issues deal with paleontology, which is kind of interesting to think about. And we also think they're very, very important. So we deal with important issues, and important issues are often controversial. And I'm going to fly past a bunch of this stuff for the sake of time. But really, a key motivator for me is trying to think about how to avoid repeating the problems that we see right now on a national stage. How can we get the next generation of adults, and hopefully change a number of the current generation of adults, to talk about controversial issues in a more productive way? I think pretty much everyone agrees that the national dialogue right now is a disaster. I'll also note that talking about climate change without talking about energy is like talking about lung cancer without talking about smoking. And that's, oh dear, I've forgotten who I'm stealing that from, but it might come to me. We will, this presentation, which we will only scratch the surface of, does talk about all of that, but with a little bit more attention to fracking, and it's based on NSF funding, and there's one book and another book, and the links to the book. And I'll also note that we do our best to provide scientific information about unconventional drilling, hydrofracking, with as little bias as possible, but we also recognize that we can't fully recognize our own biases, and then no one else can either. So that complicates things. And I've already said stuff about that. One of my favorite questions to open up a session with is to ask people where the electricity in their state comes from. And I've got listed here the 8 largest sources in for generating electricity in the U.S. It just so happens they're listed alphabetically, and it just so happens that the first 4 alphabetically are also the 4 largest for generating electricity. And I have people raise their hands and think about that, but I'll just ask you to sort of think about what are the 2 largest energy sources in your state for generating electricity, and then we'll go to what it looked like in 2012. I really need to get back and update this because the energy system is actually changing remarkably quickly. And this is now out of date. When we look at the U.S. as a whole, in 2012, we got more electricity from coal than from any other source. That is no longer true. The largest piece of the pie for electric generation in the U.S. now comes from natural gas, and coal has shrunk a lot in the last few years. And in New York State, coal, I think it's now 3 years that coal has fallen to the fifth slot on ranking. It's been overtaken by wind in about 2015 or so. It was overtaken by wind. So now this is the 2012 data again. Now the slice of New York's electricity pie that comes from coal is too small to see. It's less than 1%. And by 2020, New York State will get 0% of its electricity from coal. Most New Yorkers don't have a clue about that. I have done versions of this talk in many states, and it's interesting how different states have different levels of knowledge about where their energy comes from. If it's an energy state where there's lots of coal mines, for example, then people tend to know about that. And I just got a note from Bruce that there are a couple more questions, so I'll pause and take a couple more questions. So go ahead, Bruce.
Thanks, Don. This I think is a very good question. Shannon asks. She says her school's having a day-long series of workshops on climate change that'll include panelists and workshops led by her science department, and she recognizes that climate change is a very complex issue. She's wondering if you can recommend any big bang for your buck activities or labs or resources that you would use if you only had one day to reach a lot of students.
Great question. I think actually looking at this question is quite interesting. And if I go back a slide or two and click here, it'll take me to the Energy Information Administration website, which is fascinating. And you can look at any state, and it'll bring up this interactive map where you can click on any part of the energy infrastructure in the country and get data about it, which I think is pretty interesting. You can also look at some quick facts about whatever state you happen to be in, look at information about consumption by source, and the pie charts were derived from this data set. So I think spending some time looking at this site is a good one. Another activity that I like to do is stepping through what happens to a gallon of gasoline when you burn it, and I have a presentation on that I can send a link to Bruce, and he can put it in the show notes, I guess. And it steps through not only how burning a gallon of gasoline, which weighs about 6 pounds and has some, sort of suggested ways of passing around a gallon jug of water that's 3/4 full, gives you a sense of what that 6 pounds feels like. And we burn more than a gallon of gasoline per person per day in the United States. And somehow that 6 pounds that you put in your tank is gone. But it's not really gone, because we know that energy is neither created nor destroyed. It's changed in form. And in case of burning gasoline, you take the gasoline as a mixture with the largest part of that mixture being octane. And it steps through the chemical reaction of octane combustion and turning that 6 pounds of gasoline into 19 pounds of carbon dioxide, because it combines with oxygen in the atmosphere. And then it steps through thinking about how much volume that takes up, and uses, passes around balloons and lets kids think about the empty balloon, then filling it up to be about a gallon size, and how many gallon-sized balloons you need to hold 19 pounds of carbon dioxide. And it works out to be about 1,100. From burning 1 gallon of gasoline, you get 1,100 gallons of carbon dioxide gas at standard temperature and pressure. And so I've used that at a number of climate summits, and it's, I think, a pretty powerful demonstration. So that's one thought, and like I said, I'll share the link with Bruce so that he can include that in the show notes.
Actually, Don, if you have that, you can put that information into the chat box, and if you share it with the entire audience, everyone should be able to have that. And I think that what I'd like to do is that a number of folks have asked for some additional resources that I would like to share right now.
Okay.
And so right now I just wanted to let everyone know that there are a number of additional resources to what Don and Ingrid had mentioned. Climate.gov is an excellent place to find both teaching resources as well as informational resources that you can share with students at a range of ages. The Climate Connection is great for getting a weekly digest of information on climate, specifically from NOAA. If you're looking for more data than you can possibly handle, opening up the fire hose, the National Centers for Environmental Data actually is one of the largest repositories in the United States and possibly even the world for climate, oceanic, atmospheric, and weather data. NOAA also has an excellent paleoclimatology website with slides and additional information. And there's a terrific podcast that NOAA's National Ocean Service did a few years ago, which focused on preparing for climate-related impacts. Some other non-NOAA but partner resources are the Climate Adaptation Mitigation e-learning website. The Union of Concerned Scientists Climate Hot Map is actually quite good for looking to see what impacts are in different areas and what potential solutions may be. And there's an organization that has Earth Labs that has a terrific series of high school level modules on climate that focus on very specific parts. And I will say that the Will Steger group, currently known as Climate Generation, has an excellent series of climate and energy curriculum, as well as professional development resources and how to engage the public on climate. So I really recommend all of those various resources to you. I also like to remind everyone to check your email that you have received a post-webinar poll. Would appreciate if you completed it right after the broadcast. It is really important to our program. Also, for those folks who came in late, a reminder that stewardship community applications are now being accepted by NOAA Planet Stewards. If you're accepted into the group, we will help you learn how to write a federal funding proposal, including aspects of evaluation. If you're accepted, you can receive up to $2,500 to carry out a stewardship project, and you can meet educators across the country that share your interest in STEM. If you go to the bottom, you'll see at our NOAA Planet Stewards website, you can get more information and the link to apply. And we are accepting applications until midnight, December 2nd. And if you want to learn more about applying and the process and what being part of the stewardship community is about, you can join us for a special webinar next Tuesday, November 20th at 8 p.m. The what's, where's, how's, and why's of joining the 2019 stewardship community with the lovely and talented and very bright Miss Molly Harrison, who is my collaborator on NOAA Planet Stewards. And all that information and more is on the Planet Stewards upcoming events webpage. And for those of you who are interested in diving a little deeper, there's also a book club that we host. Our next book club is going to be meeting on November 26th. And the dial-in information is here, and it's also on our website. It's going to be Tales from an Uncertain World, What Other Assorted Disasters Can Teach Us About Climate Change. It's by Lisa Gardner, and Lisa, in fact, the author of the book, will be leading the book club. So we're very pleased about that. Spaces are limited. We only have about 50 or 60 seats. If you do want to attend, I really recommend that you get on the line early. It is a toll-free number for everyone. And
I will say Lisa's great.
Yes, Lisa is remarkable. She is terrific. And you know what? Before I stop the recording, we're not going to necessarily end the webinar, but before I stop the recording, I just would like to let everybody know that I am very grateful that people came back on in all the years that I have done these webinars. We have never had a webinar that has completely ended on folks. So my sincere apologies for that. I'm going to look into the technology and see what happened there. But I thank you for returning, and I'd like to thank Don and Heidi for joining us. And also we can take some more questions after we end the recording, and also respond and give you some more resources in the chat. So thanks everyone who showed up.
Yes,
And I'll end the recording now, and we can continue to take questions. Thanks a lot.